On a moonless night in March of 1944, a Royal Navy motor torpedo boat cut its engines and drifted toward the dark coast of Brittany. A rubber dinghy was lowered over the side. Climbing down into it was not a commando, not a trained paratrooper, not any figure that German counterintelligence would have flagged as a threat. It was, to all appearances, an elderly French peasant woman, stooped, gray-haired, with teeth worn down to the stumps, padding her shuffling walk with a heavy wool skirt and an oversized sweater. She carried a battered suitcase. She moved slowly, carefully, as old women do. The Gestapo had been hunting her for 3 years. They had sent urgent cables across occupied Europe warning that she was, in their own documented words, the most dangerous of all Allied spies. They had flooded the city of Lyon with 500 additional agents to find her. They had plastered her likeness across wanted posters from Paris to Marseille. And now, on a cold Breton beach in the dark, she waded ashore and walked right past their entire apparatus, because not one of them thought twice about an old woman limping with a walking stick. Her name was Virginia Hall. She was 37 years old, born in Baltimore, Maryland, and for the better part of a decade, the United States government had told her, in bureaucratic language both firm and insulting, that she simply wasn't suited for service. She had spent years working as a consular clerk in European embassies, building fluent French, Italian, and German, developing an extraordinary instinct for people, geography, and danger. She wanted to be a diplomat. She took the qualifying examinations. She studied. She applied. The State Department had other ideas. In 1933, while bird hunting in Turkey, she accidentally shot herself, and surgeons amputated her left leg below the knee. She named the wooden prosthetic she was fitted with Cuthbert, a wry, practical joke she would carry for the rest of her life. When she applied for a diplomatic post, the State Department replied that the loss of a limb constituted a physical disability disqualifying her from the Foreign Service. She applied again. They said no again. She appealed. They said no a third time. The machinery of American diplomacy in the 1930s had no room for a woman on a wooden leg. The answer was final, until the world changed. When France fell in June of 1940, Virginia Hall was driving an ambulance for the French army. She escaped to London, and through a chance connection, landed a phone call with a senior officer of Winston Churchill's newly formed Special Operations Executive, the agency Churchill had tasked with setting occupied Europe ablaze. The officer who answered that call was impressed enough to put her through training immediately. Weapons, sabotage, disguise, tradecraft. The SOE needed someone who spoke the language, knew the culture, and had the steady nerves to operate alone in a country where the wrong word to the wrong stranger meant arrest, interrogation, and a bullet. Virginia Hall had all of it. In August of 1941, she entered Vichy, France, posing as a reporter for the New York Post. She was the first female agent the SOE had ever deployed inside occupied France. Her superiors, by their own later admission, did not expect her to survive more than a few days. She stayed 15 months. Working out of Lyon, the crossroads city that had become the beating heart of French resistance, Hall built from nothing an intelligence network she codenamed Heckler. She recruited doctors, brothel owners, police officers, forgers, and couriers. She established safe houses across the region, organized escape routes for downed Allied airmen, and channeled money and weapons to resistance cells scattered across southern France. She also ran what amounted to an underground railroad for hunted SOE agents, funneling them from safe house to safe house, toward the Spanish border and freedom. She transmitted intelligence to London through a wireless set she operated from shifting locations, knowing that German direction-finding trucks were constantly circling the city, triangulating transmissions, hunting the signal. She moved after every broadcast. She kept no notes. She trusted her memory and her instincts and the network of loyal people she had assembled. All of this while the Gestapo grew steadily more aware that someone extraordinary was working against them. The French began calling her La Dame qui boite, the limping lady. The Germans put her on their most wanted list, with bounties attached and agents assigned. They described her in their internal dispatches as a phantom, impossible to pin down, seemingly everywhere, leaving no trail. She kept working. In October of 1941, Vichy police raided an SOE meeting in Marseille. A meeting Hall had been scheduled to attend, but by instinct or fortune had skipped. 12 agents were arrested and eventually transferred to an internment camp at Mauzac, near Bergerac. Hall resolved to get them out. She couldn't go near the prison herself, too well known. Instead, she recruited Gaby Bloch, the wife of one of the imprisoned men, to make regular visits to the camp with food parcels. The guards never looked closely enough. Concealed inside tins of sardines and packages of provisions were tools. One of the prisoners, wireless operator Georges Béguet, used those tools and the sardine tins themselves to fashion a key to the barracks door. Hall, working from a distance, assembled the safe houses, vehicles, disguises, and 2 stolen French police uniforms the escaping men would need. On July 15, 1942, all 12 walked calmly out of Mauzac and dissolved into the French countryside. Hall immediately seeded false intelligence that British aircraft had already whisked them to England. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief in Lyon, was furious. He flooded the city with additional agents. He never found them. But the net was closing. By late 1942, with the Allied landings in North Africa imminent and the German occupation expanding into what had been the Vichy Free Zone, Hall sent London a message that, "My time is about up." London agreed she should leave. The problem was how. She couldn't fly. She couldn't parachute, not with a prosthetic leg. She arranged her own escape entirely without waiting for London to organize anything. By train south to Perpignan, then on foot over the Pyrenees into Spain. It was November. The pass she crossed sat at 7,500 feet. The route covered roughly 50 miles. She walked it in 2 days on Cuthbert in winter cold, while the prosthetic ground into her stump and turned it raw and bloody. Somewhere along the high passes, she radioed London that Cuthbert was causing her trouble. A clueless London signals officer, unfamiliar with her private nomenclature, radioed back a reply that has since become one of the more darkly comic footnotes of the entire war. "If Cuthbert troublesome, eliminate him." She did not eliminate Cuthbert. She kept walking. Spain arrested her at the border for illegal entry. American diplomatic pressure eventually secured her release. She made it to London, battered, limping harder than usual, and immediately demanded to go back. The SOE said absolutely not. She was too well known, too compromised, too dangerous to send into France again. Her face was on posters. The Gestapo knew her gait, her habits, the way she moved. The answer was final. So Virginia Hall left the SOE and joined the American Office of Strategic Services. The United States had not even been in the war when she had first gone into France on behalf of the British. Now the OSS, the spy agency that General Donovan was assembling in the American mold, was building its own networks across Europe and desperately needed experienced people who already knew the terrain. Hall was among the most experienced field operatives either country had produced. She had spent over a year inside occupied France, run a network of dozens, sprung 12 men from an internment camp, and walked out of the country on one leg through a mountain pass in winter. The OSS had no hesitation whatsoever. They sent her straight back. She returned to France in March of 1944, 3 weeks before her 38th birthday. The OSS had given her a cover identity, Marcel Montagny, a rural Frenchwoman. To inhabit it, Hall went further than most operatives would have dared. She found a London makeup artist to teach her to draw wrinkles into her face. She visited a dentist and had her teeth ground down to match the worn, uneven stumps of a French peasant woman. She dyed her hair a dirty gray-black and pulled it back in a severe bun. She padded her clothing to alter her silhouette and retrained her walk, shuffling her feet in a way that changed the rhythm of Cuthbert's gait and masked the familiar limp the Gestapo had memorized from their dossiers. Then she took up residence near a farmhouse, spent her days herding goats, churning milk, and trading quiet pleasantries with the neighbors she had come to arm and protect and direct. The most wanted Allied spy in France was hiding in plain sight, not in shadows, but in the ordinary light of morning, among people who never looked twice at a stout old woman with bad teeth and sensible shoes. Her assignment this time was the most consequential she had ever been given. D-Day was approaching, and the Allies needed the French resistance unified, armed, and ready to strike the moment the invasion began. Hall's area of operations was the Haute-Loire region of south-central France. She organized drop zones for weapons and supply deliveries, established safe houses across the region, recruited new resistance, trained fighters who had never held a weapon, unified feuding partisan factions under a single operational structure, and transmitted intelligence to London almost daily. The Germans were everywhere. The risk of exposure was constant and immediate. She kept working. Between the spring of 1944 and the liberation of her area that fall, the network Virginia Hall built and commanded cut 16 railway lines, derailed 8 trains, blew up 4 railway bridges, severed all German telephone lines in the region, and killed approximately 80 German soldiers, suffering only 12 casualties themselves. The OSS assessment described her network as a most powerful factor in the harassing of enemy troops. That dry bureaucratic language barely captures what she had accomplished in the rolling farmland of south-central France, while disguised as an old woman nobody needed to watch. When the war in Europe ended in the spring of 1945, General William Donovan, the head of the OSS, held a small ceremony. It was small because Hall had requested it that way, no photographs, no public announcement. Donovan pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to her lapel. It was the Army's second highest decoration for valor in combat. Virginia Hall was the only civilian woman to receive it during the Second World War. President Truman had wanted to present it personally at the White House. He was told she preferred not to make a public appearance because she planned to continue undercover work. He sent his congratulations. The citation accompanying the medal read, in part, that she had displayed rare courage, perseverance, and ingenuity, and that her efforts contributed materially to the successful operations of the resistance forces in support of the Allied expeditionary forces in the liberation of France. She also received the British Member of the British Empire from King George VI and the Croix de Guerre from France. She went on to work for the Central Intelligence Agency until her mandatory retirement in 1966 at age 60. She was, even then, one of only a handful of women to hold a senior position in the CIA's clandestine service. She and Paul Goylot, an OSS lieutenant who had served under her command in France, had married quietly after the war. They lived on a farm in Maryland. She never wrote a memoir. She gave almost no interviews. The operations she had run were too sensitive, she said, and the people who had helped her in France were still alive. One of Hall's biographers retraced her Pyrenees escape route, the crossing she had made in November of 1942. He was a marathon runner, fit and experienced in good weather with modern equipment. He found the route genuinely grueling. Virginia Hall had covered the same terrain in winter on a prosthetic leg, with the Gestapo a day behind her. The American government had told Virginia Hall more than once in informal language that she was unfit for service. The Gestapo had declared her, in an urgent secret cable, the most dangerous enemy operative in all of occupied France. Both judgments were describing the same woman. What she built in France, out of sardine tins and forged identity papers, and the patience to sit beside a churn and look like an old woman nobody needed to worry about, outlasted every argument about whether she belonged there. The railway lines she cut stayed cut. The bridges she destroyed stayed down. The 12 men she freed from Mauzac went back into the field and ran networks of their own. The resistance forces she unified and armed were ready when the landings came. She never sought recognition for any of it. The soldier she had never been allowed to become had simply gotten on with the war and changed its course in the process. What her story has come to represent in the decades since historians finally cleared enough classification to tell it in full is something more than one woman's remarkable record. It is a reminder that the machinery that assesses who belongs, who is capable, who is fit for service, can be spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. The State Department's paperwork said she was a liability. The Gestapo's dispatches said she was their greatest threat. Both documents were stamped at roughly the same period in history. Only one of them was right.